Too often we picture God as some immovable rock when in fact it is God and God alone who never rests. This is from our first reading. Too often we picture God as some immovable rock when in fact it is God and God alone who never rests. Now, William Sloane Coffin made this observation some time ago, and it still rings true today. We don't know a whole lot about the divine, so much so that many of us here doubt its existence. But we all at times have found ourselves picturing this force, this energy, this God thing as distant and otherworldly, as something far, far from our own understanding. And much of what we do here at church reinforces this idea. For example, not too long ago, and I know most of you remember this because of the wax, we wrapped up our Advent season with Christmas Eve services at 5 and 7. For what in our minds is a more or less unchanging ritual. On Christmas Eve, we read the scripture, we sing the carols. Most of the carols are very old by our standards. None of them are written less than a century ago. And at the end, we light the candles and we sing Silent Night while standing in the dark. While standing in the dark. Trying to enact, to embody some sort of timeless stillness. And to a certain extent, we do just that. But really, God is in the world. And the world here, but the world out there too. And that swirls on. And that restless current still breaks in to this room on Christmas Eve during candles. Now, at both services, there is the sound of children and some adults rustling and shifting in their seats. There's talking, there's coughing. It turns out that we're a tough crowd to quiet down even for an hour. And there's the ever-present fact, particularly at the 5 o'clock service, for those of you who go to the 5, that the children of a dozen years ago are sitting in their old accustomed seats, but now they're adults. They're collegians and graduates coming back to visit their parents and each other and the church that helped to raise them. The so-called Christmas and Easter crowd is here too. People we haven't seen in some time, and we welcome them, happy to see a familiar face back again, even if it seems to be a somewhat older face than the last time we saw it. And also there are people who are no longer here at those services, who have drifted away or who have passed on, and we remember them and their places too. And all of these images are markers for change. Change seeps its way into our service, even during candles. It's the way of the world. It's the way of the transcendent. But we still find that stillness, most of us, most of the time. While our old rituals give us some measure of peace, it isn't God who stops moving. It is we who have stopped or have tried to. Now, many of us, when we come to church, come here to do just that, to pause, to stop, to reflect. We talk a great deal here, and we talk about how to live our lives and what our priorities should be. And that's part of the reflection, because we know that warm, fuzzy feelings do not a religion make. We have been talking a lot about that in church these days as well. Even though we come here to catch our breath, to regain our focus, after a couple of hours of hanging out here and maybe having some coffee, we know we have to get back in the water again, and we need to live out our beliefs so we aren't completely swept up by forces beyond our control. Now, the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus, how many of you know Heraclitus? Someone I read here frequently, so I hope it doesn't come out of left field. Apparently it did. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus told us long ago that everything changes and nothing stands still. Everything changes, he said, and nothing stands still. Or more famously, he said, you can't step in the same river twice. The fact is, the stream moves on. And we have the potential to lose ourselves, to be swept away in our passivity, to let the current take us. But while it sounds rather pleasant, we don't really want that all of the time. We want to go where we wish to go. We do not want to go where we are told, like the Magi, not like Herod. We want to change the river's flow. We want to swim. It's not enough to be detached and curious about the world that's going by. We know this, and we shall be engaged as we are always engaged. Now, I bring this up today partly because many of us find ourselves returning tomorrow to work or to school. And I suspect that many of you are feeling a bit torn about that. I know I am. There's been something of a lull and a break, which would be nice to continue. But the promise of action also draws us toward that rushing river once again. Either way, we don't really have much of a choice. We are returning. Christmas ends tomorrow. And the question for us is, as we step into that river that we know has changed, the question is, are we willing to change as well? Have we paid attention? Have we paid attention to ourselves and to our stories? Have we felt the movement of our hearts this season? And are we willing to be the change? Are we willing to work, not just in the world as it is, but to work for the world we would like to see? After all, the future is unwritten, and we can alter the course of things to affect that future. And that is why we didn't read the story of the Magi today. That is why we read from Mark. You see, Mark is all about the new beginning and the fresh start. Mark doesn't care about mangers or Bethlehem or shepherds or flaky old astrologers. In fact, we haven't read from Mark for weeks because he doesn't care about Christmas. Babies will be born, after all. What Mark wants to tell us about is what happens after. Not being born, but living the life outlined by a just man, a teacher, and a prophet. Mark wants us to keep our eyes on the prize, on justice, on change, on the future, where it belongs. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, Mark says in chapter 1, verse 2, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. And then he opens with John, the baptizer, standing, we imagine, in the River Jordan, doing what he does best, which is baptizing and prophesying a better future. The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me, John says. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. In fact, here, in the first part of the oldest gospel, we see, well, many things, but we see two things happening that I want to talk about today. We see that he begins with a quote. And the quote is not from John. That's the second quote. And it's not from Jesus, who the gospel is about. And it's not about any of those characters that we've been talking about for a month that populate Luke and Matthew. But it's a quote with a history for him, for Mark. In fact, he begins by citing Isaiah, finding relevance for his time in a document that was already 6 centuries old. And then he establishes a vision as he leads into John, pointing toward and working for a future that he, John, will not see. Mark grounds us in what has gone before, but he doesn't dwell on it, showing us through John and eventually through others the way to step back into that moving stream, always looking forward, always telling the truth regardless of the consequences, always seeking a broad baptism, learning and teaching a doctrine of inclusion. He challenges us, Mark does, just as all good prophets and visionaries do. Now, our time is a time of great unrest, of major difficulties. We need to be part of the solution. We need to take that first step, no matter how small or tentative it might be. The past, our shared past as a people, and our individual pasts can inform and strengthen us. And so too does the vision of our faith, providing us a language and a goal, no matter how hazy, no matter how faint. You see, Mark tells us to be like John, to acknowledge the past, but to look toward and prepare for the future we want, and to be like Jesus, to fight and sacrifice for that dream. Now, Coffin concludes our reading today by saying that it is God who says, "Behold, I create all things new." Therefore, God's most persistent enemies are those who are unwilling to move in different directions. And then Coffin says, if you choose, you are sometimes wrong. But if you never choose, you are always wrong. Now, as we leave a time in the church typically associated with stillness, and as we move into the new year, I invite you to take the time to consider choices you make, and consider those questions on your handout. Fill them out for yourself, and put the answers somewhere where you can see them. I'm going to put mine on the fridge. For as we move through this world this year, there are many questions needing some kind of answer. But the question we want to ask ourselves today as we move into communion is, how do we plan to make the world a better place this year?